Hi folks, this is your fourth video for AP Government, and we are talking about the challenges of the Articles of Confederation. So last video, we talked about the ideals of our democracy, and we ended talking about how those are seen in the Declaration of Independence. So we are going to move on to the second founding document of our country, the Articles of Confederation, and the challenges that we face as a nation because of that document. So our objectives for this unit or for this lesson are to explain the relationship between the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the debate over granting the federal government greater power that was formerly reserved to the states. Okay. So I kind of imagine our founders were in this position. This is what I have in my brain here. Like, woo, we've declared independence. Now what, right? What do we do? How is it that, while we're fighting this war, we can organize ourselves not only to win, but then set up a government that can last once we win, okay? And that is going to be the Articles of Confederation. And this is getting written and adopted during the American Revolution. Now remember, the colonies knew that they wanted to limit the power of the national government. Let's talk about why, right? After we're struggling with the British government being taxed without our consent, our natural rights are being violated, and we feel as though the British Crown has violated that social contract. As we're making this governing document, we are very reluctant to turn over any but the most essential powers to the national government. We really wanted to make sure that that kind of tyranny, that abuse of power, could never happen again. Now, what we see is the Articles of Confederation. We knew that we needed to win the revolution, and that would require uniting together all of the states, the 13 states. And the idea of the Articles of Confederation was that these states would remain independent of one another, but would join together when necessary, like during a war. Okay? So what the Articles of Confederation did was it established decentralized power. And this is going to place authority in the hands of the states. And they really called the Articles of Confederation a firm league of friendship. I don't know about you guys, but that is not how I would want our government to be considered, right? A firm league of friendship does not sound very authoritative at all. It doesn't sound like it has a lot of power. But key thing to note here, Articles of Confederation are going to decentralize, take power away from the national government. Each state under the Articles was sovereign and independent, meaning they had its own government, essentially, its own set of laws and way of doing things, which we'll talk about in a minute. Again, because we are decentralizing power, that's going to create a weak national government. In this particular document, there is one branch only, and that is a unicameral or one-house Congress. There is no executive branch, so there's no president. There is no judicial branch. There are no courts, or federal courts, I should say. The states were responsible for establishing those themselves, and that will lead into a particular set of issues in the long run. Also under the Articles of Confederation, it was required that at least 9 states must agree to enact any type of law, and all 13 had to be unanimous to amend the Articles of Confederation. Just think about that, right? Think about something as mundane or basic as trying to get your group of friends to agree on where to go to dinner or what you're going to do that a particular night. That's almost impossible, it feels like. I've been there with you guys. Now imagine that it's not deciding something like where to eat. It's how are we going to amend the document that governs our country, right? And you have all of these different interests. So that is going to lead to its own set of problems, right? So based on all of this, what could possibly go wrong? I wonder. I was kind of like, when I first learned about the Articles, I was kind of like this little girl here, like, why? Why were all of these things put into place? So let's talk about first what could the national government do? And remember, the national government is just Congress. There is only Congress. Congress can declare war and make treaties, much like it does today. But the states could refuse to recognize those treaties. That's going to be an issue. It could raise an army, but it couldn't pay for the army. It had to ask the states for money to pay troops or to provide troops, additional troops, if need be. And the national government could borrow money, just like it does today. So you can see these powers are very limited. The national government does not have many. It does have a lot of weaknesses, though. So our first weakness of the Articles of Confederation is that the national government couldn't tax the states or the people. And what it had to do was ask the states to pay, to basically ask for that tax money. If you are not aware, taxes is basically how the government functions. Your tax money is what funds government projects like building roads, paying officials, paying the military. All of those things come from taxes. So when the national government can't tax, it doesn't have any money to do hardly anything. And this particular weakness was put into place, if you remember from the last video, because we felt as though we were being unnecessarily taxed by that national government. And when we were under British control, we did not like that. So what we did was kind of go the opposite direction. Now the national government cannot tax the states. Our second weakness is that the national government could not raise or maintain an army because it lacked that centralized military power, right? Technically, it could raise an army, but it can't pay for it. It's going to have to rely on the states quite a bit when it comes to the military. The states could then refuse to send troops. And as we'll see, this leads to the national government being unable to put down disputes that happen between the states. And those disputes happen quite frequently. Our third weakness is that the national government could not regulate interstate commerce. Commerce is a fancy word for trade, and it could not regulate that between states. And of course, when it comes to trade and money, where that's involved, the states are going to have disputes. And the national government can't quell those or squash those. The problem with this as well is that because the states were in charge of trade, there's chaos in trade. There's disagreements between states. States could make their own trade agreements with other countries even. So it's very chaotic. Nothing is consistent. Our fourth weakness is that there were no executive or judicial branches, right? We only had that one branch of Congress. And think about why this was put in place. We were concerned of tyranny. Okay, I think I've outlined that pretty clearly. And we were too afraid of that strong central power. So we got rid of it. The result, though, and why this is a weakness, is that we have no effective leadership, no executive branch to enforce any kind of law. We have no Supreme Court to decide if federal laws are violating the people's rights and liberties. Or we have no federal courts even to settle disputes between states, which is the predominant purpose today. So it really created a very, very weak and ineffective and inefficient government. And our fifth and final weakness here is that it was just too difficult to pass laws and amendments. The threshold that I talked about on the last slide was too high. 9 of the 13 were required to pass a new law, and 13 out of 13, unanimous, were required to pass amendments or make changes to the Articles of Confederation. The reality of this was that no laws or changes could be made. It was hard to get states to all agree because these states had a hundreds of years at this point to develop different economies, different backgrounds, different interests. So it was really difficult to get all of the states to agree on those laws and potential changes. Now, the Articles of Confederation did have some successes as well. They are not as numerous as the weaknesses, but I think we do have to give them, the little pity clap of you tried. The very first success was the Articles of Confederation successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolutionary War. And that is what ended the American Revolution with Britain. The second success was that it was able to pass a land ordinance in 1785. And this is what's going to create a structured process for settlers to purchase farmland in the West, right? We haven't expanded completely yet, so we're starting to look and keep our eyes open on that land. And this was actually a huge success because this was profitable for the government. The government was who got paid when those settlers purchased that farmland. And since the government couldn't levy taxes, this was a good way for the government, for at least the time being, to make some money. And then the final success of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this ordinance dealt with the land that was ceded or given to us from Great Britain after the Revolutionary War. Big thing here is it's going to create a precedent or an outline for incorporating new states into the Union. It listed requirements for joining the Union of the United States. It banned slavery in those newly created states, and it required a Bill of Rights to be incorporated in that state's constitution to protect the freedoms of the citizens in the territory. So that was a very positive thing as well, because it's kind of outlining a new structure of government, right? How are we moving forward from here? And then here in this picture, I just have an image of the Northwest Ordinance. As you can see, Ohio is one of the states, the very first state actually, that was created out of the Northwest Ordinance. All right, let's talk about Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion, just as some background, happened in 1786. This is known as kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back of the Articles of Confederation. This is kind of what killed it. So this event was a group of farmers and Revolutionary War veterans protesting in Massachusetts after they lost their farms to foreclosures and failure to pay taxes. Now, after the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of economic turmoil. Right, who pays for the war? How much? There was a lot of inflation. The states, because they were responsible for deciding and carrying out trade, they had different currencies, different money. So things were very chaotic, and money didn't have the value that it used to. Now, this is a revolt of these farmers. They're upset that they lost their farms because they can't pay those taxes. They felt as though that was an unfair act done by the government. And the national government heard about this, but it could not establish an army and had no power to squash the rebellion. So the significance of this is it's going to highlight the key weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, in particular, that lack of centralized military power and the lack of tax enforcement power, right? A lot of people considered that if the national government had been the one taxing rather than the various issues of the states, maybe this wouldn't have happened. If the national government could establish an army quickly, maybe this would not have happened, or it would not have lasted as long. And the idea now is we realize that something needs to change. We need a stronger national government. So this leads us to our part 2 of setting up a new government, right? We kind of had the rough draft with the articles. This leads us to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. And we knew going into this that there were going to be several issues on the agenda. One, strengthening the national government, right? Limited by a constitution and limiting the powers of the states. Those are kind of the big lessons that we learned under the Articles of Confederation. Equality and representation are going to be issues on the agenda, as well as the regulation of slavery and the nature of the executive branch and how it is selected. And all of these questions are going to be debated heavily, which we will talk about in our next video. Now, at the Philadelphia Convention, it is important to note that the original plan was to simply revise the Articles of Confederation. But as we will see in our next few lecture videos, that ends up turning into rewriting our entire system of government. So stay tuned for that. So that concludes the Articles of Confederation, giving you an overview of its weaknesses. Remember, your learning objective was to explain the relationship between the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the debate over granting the federal government greater power that was formerly reserved to the states. So do your best answering this question. We will debrief it as a class during our learning objective check, and make sure you have your notes filled out, and I will talk to you guys soon. See you later.